23, the 10 Million Solar Roofs Act, and that it be made pending.
Is there an objection? Without an objection, the clerk shall report.
Senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 23 to amendment number 2. After Section 2, insert the following. Section.
I ask that the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, it goes without saying that I disagree with my good friend from Alabama in terms of his assessment of the climate situation. To my mind, the scientific community, overwhelming majority of scientists, have made it clear that climate change is real, caused by human activity, is already causing devastating problems in our country and around the world, that we have a limited opportunity to try to transform our energy system so a bad situation does not become much worse. And one of the ways that we transform our energy system is by moving to such sustainable energies as wind, solar, geothermal, and others. What this amendment does is propose to create, over the next 10 years, 10 million solar rooftops in this country, a massive effort to expand solar energy in this country by giving a rebate on new solar systems. As we all know, the solar industry is booming. We are seeing significant increases in the number of people who are using solar. In fact, today there are more than 13,000 megawatts of operating solar capacity, nearly 500,000 photovoltaic systems. We have made real progress in recent years, but we have a long, long way to go, and that is what this legislation would do. Madam President, I wanted to say a word about an article that appeared in many of the papers today, which I think is pretty scary stuff. And it talks about the Koch brothers being prepared to spend almost $1 billion in 2016 in order to bring forward their very right-wing agenda. When we hear these numbers about one family, the second wealthiest family in America, an extreme right-wing family, prepared to spend almost $1 billion in the coming elections, I think the American people have to ask whether or not the foundations of American democracy have been uprooted and whether or not, in fact, we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society. And I think, as many people know, what oligarchy is about is when you have very wealthy and powerful people controlling what goes on. And what the history of America presumably has been about is that ordinary people determine what happens in our country. Ordinary people elect members of the House and elect members of the Senate. And now what we have is one family worth some $85 billion prepared to spend in the next election almost as much as Obama spent, almost as much as Romney spent in the last presidential election. Madam President, my guess is that in the coming years what you're going to see is that the major and most effective and most powerful political party in America is not the Republican Party, it is not the Democratic Party, it is the Koch brothers party. They already have assembled, as I understand it, a political database which has more information than the Republican Party database. And we have got to take a very, very hard look at what's going on and determine whether or not this is what we believe our democracy should be: a billionaire family with more power than either the Democratic or Republican parties. In the last election, Madam President, the Republican candidate for president, Mitt Romney, spent about $446 million from his campaign committee, about half of what the Koch network plans to spend next year. President Obama spent $715 million in 2012 from his campaign committee. The difference is that Obama and Romney raised significant sums of money from people all over the country, people who may have contributed $50 or $100. And now you have one family preparing to spend almost as much money as either Obama or Romney spent. And that, to me, is a frightening situation. And it tells me loudly and clearly that we must overturn this disastrous Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. Madam President, on another subject, today I introduced legislation which calls for a $1 trillion investment to rebuild our collapsing infrastructure. And that is our roads, our bridges, wastewater plants, water systems, dams, levees, rail, airports. I think everybody in the United States Senate, and I hope everybody in America, understands that our infrastructure is collapsing. We can't avoid dealing with this issue. We can't turn our backs on this issue. I'm a former mayor, and what I can tell you is infrastructure does not get better when you ignore it. It gets worse, and it becomes more expensive to fix. For most of our history, the United States proudly led the world in building innovative infrastructure, from inland canals to the transcontinental railroad. We implemented huge flood control projects and embarked on an ambitious rural electrification program. We built modern airports and the interstate highway system. In terms of infrastructure, we were the envy of the world. Sadly, that is no longer the case. Today, the U.S. spends just 2.4% of GDP on infrastructure, less than at any point in the last 20 years. Europe spends twice that amount, and China spends close to 4 times our rate. We are falling further and further behind, and that is not where the United States of America should be. Today, we are 12th in the world in terms of the quality of our infrastructure when we used to be number 1. 1 out of every 9 bridges in our country is structurally deficient, and nearly a quarter are functionally obsolete. Almost 1/3 of our roads are in poor and mediocre condition, and more than 42% of urban highways are congested. Urban and suburban transit systems are struggling to address deferred maintenance, even as ridership steadily increases. No one argues about the need to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. And when we do that, we get an additional bonus, because if we invest $1 trillion over a 5-year period, we can create 13 million decent-paying jobs. And that is exactly what we should be doing. Real unemployment today is not 5.6%, it is 11%. Youth unemployment, 18%. African-American youth unemployment, 30%. We need to create millions of decent-paying jobs, and the best way we can do that is by rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.